Forgive the warmth. It's really hot in here. Understand if people need to loosen up. Not going to be offended if you begin to disrobe. This is very much a work in progress. I thought that might get a laugh out of somebody. I'm glad I got Jill with her mouth full. Lead with a joke, always. Very much a work in progress, and that's in the spirit of the colloquium. We are assuming our primary audience here are doctoral students. We are, in the spirit of disrobing, going to be a little revelatory about our sort of where we are in this process, and I'll step aside from the sort of formal presentation at various points to offer what we might think of as helpful guidance for doctoral students embarking on research. One of the things that you're going to learn from this presentation, we're going to do it in two parts. I'm going to take more of the front end, the conceptual stuff, and Amanda's going to show you more of the data, and we're going to explore that data a little bit. You're going to, rather than see the results, you're going to see the challenges we've been facing with making this data usable, and I think that's useful for you as doctoral students to understand how much work and effort goes into making what on the face of it will be clean data that you just pull off the web. How difficult and challenging that can be to make it valid and usable. So we're going to spend a little time doing that. And our goal here for ourselves is to get some constructive feedback. So we are really looking for you to critique in a friendly way our work. And just because David announced me as the dean doesn't mean I'm immune or that you should not be allowed to critique. In fact, I'm opening the door to say we welcome it and invite it. Amanda's going to have to actually go give an abbreviated version of this later this week. She's flying out to California to present to one of our funders that I'll talk about in a minute. And I'm actually, I don't know if I told you this, I'm actually going to conduct an interview. You'll see that it's a mixed method approach tomorrow with one of our potential contributor to this. So any guidance is very much welcome. And as is typical, we'll talk for a while, but by all means interrupt us as we go through. So I'm going to talk to start just about the genesis of this. This may seem like a very narrow and obscure topic, sort of federal contracting and small business set-asides. But for us, it's part of a larger research agenda, as David sort of spelled out as he walked through our CVs. Amanda and I both study government contracting broadly, and this was sort of a funny project that fell into our laps. I was approached several years ago, within a month, by two different lobbying organizations that were representing middle-sized firms. And by mid-size, don't worry so much about the technicalities, but imagine the marketplace of federal contractors in three buckets. You got big federal integrator contractors. Think of something like Lockheed Martin, the name on our boardroom upstairs, or throw me another one, and there was another big one. Booz Allen, Boeing, SAIC, sort of big, massive contractors, and then you got small, tiny firms, may only be 20, 30 people, and then in between there's a bunch of other stuff, right? And these two lobbying associations approached me and said, we represent, in one case it was IT firms, and another it was program management firms. We're getting squeezed. Right? The marketplace for federal procurement is becoming smaller for mid-sized firms. Big, massive integrators are dominating the open competitions, and as I'm going to explain to you here, small businesses are dominating what are basically a sheltered marketplace for small businesses, and in between the middle market's getting squashed. And they wanted some scholarship on this. I'm not a gun for hire. I'm not here to just report on something for a funder, but I was intrigued enough about this question. I didn't know a lot about the composition of the marketplace and the way they described it. I was sort of curious about, what is that true? Is this really, I mean, your experience may be your experience, but does that really describe the whole federal marketplace? And if so, if that's in fact the case, then the interest for me is that may be undermining the value that the government gets from procurement, because the whole impetus for procurement, at least the argument is that we benefit from competition, right? If we have a free and open marketplace of organizations competing to deliver goods and services to the government gets better value, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit. And we as taxpayers get better value for the use of our taxes because we're delivering higher quality products on time and at a cost that the government can afford. Well, if big firms are beginning to dominate the open marketplace, and then there's this little sheltered environment for small businesses, and then the middle market is getting squeezed, you're taking away some of the vibrancy and the benefits of competition. So I was intrigued to see, is this in fact the case? So Amanda and I partnered on this, and we've gotten funding, and this is a message to graduate students as well, for Truth in Advertising here. Those two lobbying firms did at one point say, hey, we'll give you some money to do this research, but they had an answer that they wanted, right? I mean, they were looking for a particular outcome. I was uncomfortable about entering into that relationship. Fortunately, we were able to find two other funding sources to support this research. One is something here at Ohio State, and Rob and Noah, I think, have received funding, and somebody at the National Center for the Middle Market, which is out of the Fisher College of Business, is a research center here on campus that funds research on the middle market. They're largely looking at the kind of B2B world, business to business kind of interactions, but they were interested enough in business to government interactions that they gave us some funding. And the second is the one that Amanda is going to give her presentation to later this week, which is the Naval Postgraduate School has an ongoing acquisition support. And so for any of those of you in the room who may be interested in procurement research, government contracting research, the Naval Postgraduate School is a great research source. They give about $100K per award each year. It's been relatively constant, and so it's been a source for some of my research in the past. It has a certain cachet because it's the Department of the Navy, and so it's a worthy funding source to pursue. So anyway, that didn't taint our research. We didn't feel like, oh, we've got to deliver a result because a certain entity is paying for it, so there's an arm's length there. So ultimately, again, we're interested, I'm going to tell you a story about small businesses, but as you'll see, there's a downstream interest here in what does this mean for the government? What does it mean for how value is delivered to the government? So what we're going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time educating you hopefully about federal procurement and the small business context. It was a learning experience for me on that small business side. We're going to tell you what our research questions are, and then I'm going to lay out, theory is probably a misnomer, a bit of a conceptual framework we're utilizing. We're going to school on some of the small business literature, which is new to both of us, but I'm going to put that into a larger public sector research framework. Then I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, and Amanda's going to talk about the data and methods, share with you a little bit of our preliminary findings, and we want to emphasize preliminary, and then talk about next steps and ultimately, hopefully, solicit guidance from you all as we embark on the next phases of this. So, putting this research in context, there's sort of four categories of research on public sector contracting. The one where way too many people have spent way too much time is that top one. It's the make or buy decision. It has its roots in sort of private sector inquiry into why do firms exist. It reaches back to Coase. Some of you have read what are the boundaries of the firm. That led in the public sector to ask, why in some cases do we outsource, in other cases do we deliver with government employees and so forth. And again, in the private sector, we frame that decision as the make or buy decision. Why do we make? Some cases, other times we buy. I've spent way too much of my effort on this question. A lot of publications for me have come in that space. And again, I say this as a warning, there's a tendency, and I see it now as a reviewer, a lot of people are continuing to rush into a very crowded marketplace. It's not that we know everything there is to know about that, but those are increasingly less and less interesting questions. To really make a mark in that space, you really have to differentiate. You have to come forward with something that's truly innovative. And I'm happy to explain sort of what we know in that space, but just know that that's where a lot of people start as they come down this funnel. next bucket, or next sort of tier in this reverse pyramid, is on contract design. Once we decide to outsource, how does the government design the contract? How do they embark on the transaction? This is largely populated by folks on the one hand in the legal world, right? I mean, you see a lot of literature from legal scholars who've written about what the law says about how we can design contract. And on the other side are economists who are sort of writing about what are the most efficient kinds of contract designs to deliver the best kind of outcome that we might want. Also a very dense sort of area. Here's the sweet spot, right? I mean, and here's where a school of public affairs produces great people like Amanda who do work on governance and management, right? Once we've made the decision to outsource, once we've designed the contractual relationship, what's the relationship that's structured between the purchaser, the government, and the vendor, whether that be another government, often it is, whether it be a private firm, or whether it be a nonprofit organization. How is that relationship managed? Because as we come to learn, a lot of the kinds of things that the government buys are not spot market transactions. Some of it is, but a lot of it are more ongoing relationships with a vendor. So it's that you're providing a service or you're providing that product repeatedly. And so the decisions of people within the government, both the contract managers, but also the users of the good or service, has a lot of influence on this final thing, the outcomes we get from it. There's very little research in this space. So if one were to want to make a name for themselves as a scholar in this space, here's the area where there's less and less research. Now, part of this, as you're going to learn today, is a challenge of the data, right? It's much easier to get data on this. It's equally easy to get data on this because you can look at the contracts. It's a lot harder to peer in and see how parties are interacting in an exchange, and it's very hard to get outcomes, right? But that's the holy grail, because that's what everybody wants to know. The promise of this is if you outsource, it's cheaper, it's better, it's whatever. Well, that begs, well, how would we know, right? Well, as scholars, we tend to plow where there's a lot of data, so we plow up here. But if you really want to make a name, it's down here. And Amanda's done some really interesting work at this space on the design of contracts, and particularly the use of incentives, and then how it impacts management, and how people behave in the implementation of those incentives. Well, that sets up nicely then, how are we going to assess whether those incentives deliver and what kind of outcomes do we see, right? So that's the kind of pathway I would encourage you as a scholar to think about. So our research fits into this pyramid. And here's the framework that, this is a bit of an imposition on Amanda in the sense that I'm going to throw something out there that's something that's been the basis for a lot of my work. I don't know that it's fair to say that it's the basis for her, but the pleasure of a partnership like this is we get to have conversations about these things, sometimes in public.
And sometimes you're surprised.
Sometimes you're surprised. But I don't think she'll object to anything I'm about to say here. The framework I've come to utilize in my research on government contracting is there's sort of three dimensions to how we intellectually explore whether a contract delivers value. The first is you start with values, right? And this is also basically a way to think about public sector research broadly. But in our field, a lot of where we start from, sometimes explicitly and too often I think implicitly, is a discussion about a set of values we're trading off, right? And in our field, we have this distinction that sometimes we make between what we call public values and private values. And so in the contracting space, we might say in terms of public values are things like accountability, justice, fairness, transparency. And then the private values are things like cost efficiency, economy, sometimes narrowly reduced to profit. And those two things are juxtaposed. There's between the public sector and the private sector. Now, personally, I find that maybe not a false distinction, but an overemphasized distinction. On the public sector side, and I'm thinking largely through a procurement lens, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who, in acting on behalf of the taxpayers, said, my job is to maximize transparency, accountability, at the expense of cost efficiency and economy. Right? And similarly, on the private sector side, now having worked with lots of private firms, done lots of interviews, partnerships, et cetera, it's a rare instance where I think I found someone who says, you know, I'm only interested in this for pure profit, and I don't care in my organization that people are treated fairly, that we have some degree of transparency, that there's accountability, the marketplace is in some ways accountable, is a means for holding us accountable. Those values are present in both sets of organizations and in both sets of contexts. It's what's the balance at any given time, right? And so at the starting point for any piece of research on government contracting, as you're going to see, you're weighing these different values. And in any given moment, some of them may take precedence and may make it harder to achieve other values. And so the story I'm going to tell you about small business contracting is in some ways trying to balance one set of values against another set of values. And how do we, or is it possible to optimize, or does one come at the expense of the other? Right? So it starts for us by thinking about the values. That then leads to a set of institutions. And by institutions, I mean the formal and informal norms and rules that condition behavior. And in the contracting space, we most often think of that as the law. Right? And that's why legal scholars write a lot about constitutional design, et cetera. But at the federal level, the embodiment of the set of values that we talk about that get codified in law is something called the Federal Acquisition Regulations. They are, think of them as kind of a meta body of law. It's a big regulatory document that guides how every agency engages in purchasing. And as I'm going to show you, at the front end, they prescribe, these are the values we're trying to maximize as we engage in this behavior. And then, moving down the chain towards more of the managerial decision-making, you know, what can we do to make these values manifest? It says, here's what you're allowed to do, here's what you're not allowed to do. If you buy this kind of product, you can buy it in this way. So if you're buying a product that's really easy to describe, hard tables, certain dimensions, you should use what's called a fixed price contract. If you're buying something that's really kind of hard to describe, it's hard to define exactly how it's going to be used, the producer's going to need to figure out how to manufacture it, like an information technology system, you are allowed to use a cost reimbursement contract to let them transfer that risk and sense to you of the purchaser of not being able to describe in a high degree of precision exactly what it is you want. Right? So these institutions, the law, shapes what can and can't be done. Right? And like all of us presumably know, there's a gray zone in there, right? The law can only prescribe so much. So then a set of informal norms takes place. Within different agencies, there are different cultures around how to acquire products and how they're used. Right? So that then shapes how a transaction takes place. And finally are the markets themselves. Different products have different kinds of suppliers. Different characteristics of the products influence the dynamics of behavior in any transaction. So for us, or for me as a contracting scholar, the theories I utilize have to fit into this framework. They have to be able to make transparent what the value trade-offs are. They have to incorporate what the institutional arrangements are. And they have to incorporate market dynamics to help us explain people's behavior in those transactions and whether we get the outcomes that we desire. So for me, this is think of it as a framework. I rely a lot on transaction cost economics and principal agent theory in my own research. I can map that to this market. I'm not going to bore you with that now. I've also can draw on institutionalism of the sociological variety and map that to this framework as well. Rob, you had a question.
Yeah, when you're setting up this framework, and then you started out by talking about the difference between the smaller contractors and the bigger contractors, how much, I assume for the smallest agencies, they're completely reliant on external counsel. They're doing their own kind of make or buy decisions in terms of the legal arrangements, aren't they? And so in large organizations, probably
have more internal. Yeah, it's a general rule, and I'll actually, that'll be a nice segue into, now I'm going to introduce you to the federal marketplace a little bit. But yeah, it's a general rule. One way of generally answering this, bigger agencies tend to have more contract management capabilities, capacity, that's more than just legal. It could be more knowledge of the marketplace, et cetera, where smaller agencies have less of that capability and capacity. And often increasingly are having to buy it. Right? They're buying that contract management.
So the values you're looking at may partially be their own, maybe partially.
Maybe injected by who they're buying it from. Absolutely. Okay, so this is data from Bloomberg. Only goes up to 2014, but I can draw the line out farther for you. This is prime government contract spending. These are billions of dollars over the last several decades. So the high water mark is right here, 2008. About $600 billion purchased by the US federal government. Is that a lot of money? Yes, it's a lot of money, right? The federal budget, discretionary, is about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, depending on what year we're looking at. So contract spending, this is discretionary. If we put aside interest on the debt, entitlement programs, et cetera, represents anywhere from about 1/3 to 1/2 of all federal government spending. So a lot of what the government buys at the federal level is, or sorry, a lot of what the government spends is acquired through a contract. Right? So that's why, for me, it's important to study contracting, because it's a lot of what the government does. And so if we think about how we organize to deliver services, a significant portion of it is done through an arm's length relationship. Here, we're at about the low water mark, 300 million. Anybody want to know why it climbs? 2000 to 2008, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan. It peaks in 2008. It's the election of Obama, the financial crisis. We start to come down. Obama starts to try and reduce the use of contracting as a vehicle for
Well, it can't be war as such, right? Because there's also a war in 1999 and I didn't see contracting increase.
But it's the nature of how we conducted that war. But just empirically, this spending, because who's the biggest purchaser? It's the US Department of Defense. So almost $300 billion purchased by the DoD, and this goes a little bit to answer your question.
Well, it could be a political makeup. The Democrats will be less inclined to contract out to the Republicans. I mean,
On the margin, Bill Clinton, big proponent of, under the reinventing government movement, the National Performance Review. Yeah, and there's been a lot of research back to that make or buy decision. A lot of people say political ideology matters a lot. It does, but really on the margin, right? So, biggest purchasers, the US Department of Defense, and just as a point of scale, in 2016, Apple, the largest companies in the world, announced a mind-boggling acquisition plan for $16 billion in capital expenditures. Basically a rounding error, right? I mean, the Department of Defense is the largest purchaser in the world. They buy more stuff than anybody, and they dwarf all the other agencies. So a lot of the purchasing that goes on is through the Department of Defense. Now, all these other guys buy stuff too, and they buy lots of different kinds of stuff, but they don't buy on the scale or the complexity always of the DoD. And you'll see that reflected a little bit in the kind of the way we drew our sample for our data. Okay, so when it comes to the values inherent in government contracting, as I mentioned before, the federal acquisition regulations guides procurement officers to balance 3 values: cost, quality, and schedule. Right? And this is the term of art is what's called best value. So when a procurement officer, a purchaser, a buyer for the US government goes into the marketplace, they are guided to trade off, to find the best combination of the cost of the product, the quality of that product, and schedule, meaning the likelihood that it'll be delivered when they need it to serve their mission. Right? Now, that's not always been the case. And this speaks to the shifting values that's present in any given era and in the world of purchasing. So How many of you have seen Hidden Figures? Wonderful scenes of Senator Glenn hurtling through space, and then the flames go up, and he's shaking as he comes down. When he was asked after the re-entry at Friendship 7, reporters said, "What were you thinking?" And they were expecting, "I'd touch the face of God, I'd become one with the universe." And he said, "All I could think about was that the thousands of pieces that I was flying on were all, no, we should worry about the quality of the product relative to the cost of the product," right? So that gives procurement managers some discretion to say, I'm going to pay a little bit more. There may be a lower bidder, but I'm going to pick one that's going to deliver me a higher quality. So just baked into the rules is the sense that you can't get everything at once, right? So you got to have these trade-offs. Well, then on top of this, we've layered some of those traditional public values, right? We also say at various times, no, we want you to also maximize the quality of opportunity. That's going to set up our small business story. We're also going to ask you at some times to be concerned about justice and fairness. So just one quick aside, for example, the waning years of the Obama administration, executive order comes out that says any firm, potential vendor of the federal government that is alleged to have violated federal employment law is prohibited from engaging into a contract in the future with the federal government. So it's an executive order that says, hey, procurement officers, in addition to balancing these values, you've also got to be concerned about justice. But these things shift. Different elections, different values get maximized. What just happened? Donald Trump elected. What's one of the first things he does? Rescinds that executive order. Now gone. So that requirement off the table. We're now back into a world where these things are more prevalent than this consideration. Right? But one thing that has been enduring is quality of opportunity. For several decades, primarily starting in the 60s, the federal government said there are certain categories of vendors that we are concerned about. We want to make sure that they have equal opportunity to participate in that federal procurement marketplace. And part of the sale, part of the explanation was an equality of opportunity explanation. And those categories are small firms, veteran-owned firms, female-owned firms, minority, and Native Americans. And the Small Business Administration was largely created to ensure that these groups were treated fairly in the federal procurement marketplace, with a primary focus on the Small Business Administration, on small businesses, and that's what we're going to focus on here. And the primary mechanism by which they've done this is to set aside in any procurement a certain percentage that is to be delivered to that group and that group alone, right? So if the federal government wants to buy something, a certain percentage of it, 10 to 15%, have to go to small businesses. And so here you see the spending. I'm not going to go into the details of the different kinds of programs, all administered by the SBA, but it shows you, and think about the big scale, we're in the $300 to $600 billion range. About 50 to 60 billion of it goes to small businesses. Now,
is it a small enough amount that small businesses, once they receive this procurement or invest in, that they stay small, or do they usually become no longer small businesses?
Let me just put the T right there, knock that out. That's the question, right? It is those firms that came lobbying me said, essentially what this does is it creates a disincentive to grow, right? There's what they've described as a small business cliff. You are sheltered by these small business set-asides because there's only so many firms that qualify, and it's not an easy process to get qualified. So there's a barrier to entry there. But once you're in, the argument they were making is they don't ever want to leave. Right? There's this cliff that you jump off because all of a sudden you're a tiny little bird. Right? The threshold keeps you small, and then all of a sudden you've got to jump into the ocean and swim with these big firms that are increasingly coming to dominate the marketplace. And so there's this cliff. And what we should see then are firms that just stay small, right? And the empirical question to start for us is that true? Right? Is there this set-aside cliff? Does the marketplace in fact look like that? Or is that just anecdotal evidence? So that's the first question we've begun to explore. In just 2 minutes here, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda. The second is, what explains firm behavior around that cliff, right? I mean, who jumps and who doesn't? And what causes them to jump? Or perhaps a better way to say that is, what helps explain who succeeds in making that jump? It's harder for us to intuit why they jump, as I'll explain in a minute. Now, ultimately, we want to get to this. What policy tools optimize that balance between best value and equal opportunity? Those juxtaposition of those different values. But we feel we've got to understand this first, right? So naturally, this isn't something that scholars of public management and public organizations would dive in and look at small businesses. But we feel we need to understand these questions before we're able to fully answer this question. So that's in part why this is a much longer term exercise. So to understand firms, there's a fairly extensive literature about how firms are born and grow. And there's literally a life cycle theory of the firm that says that, I'm way oversimplifying and summarizing here, but there's sort of two stories about why firms get created by entrepreneurs. One is a mission-driven problem solver goes out and identifies something in the world that they want to fix, and they think the solution is the creation of a firm to produce the product to resolve that problem. The other is because they want to make money, right? That they start firms to generate profits that then come back to them. Having spoken to people like this before, and now people in the midst of this, it's usually both, right? I mean, usually an entrepreneur is driven to start a firm because they're passionate about the product that they're providing, but they want to make some money doing it, right? And then that explains what business scholars would say is this path of you have your startup here, then you go through this rapid growth, and then there's a kind of flattening of the curve as you hit maturity, and then all firms hit some decline. Some of them succeed in reconfiguring themselves, innovating whatever, and they're reborn, and others die. Now, this isn't really a theory, it's just a description, but it is presented as a theory in the business literature, and so we're trying to learn as much as we can about this. There's some scholars in at various parts. Actually, SPIA has David Aldrich. I don't know if you remember David Aldrich, who ran the Center for Entrepreneurialism there. Others who follow this logic. So we sort of utilize this as our starting point. But the thing for us is the small business set-aside essentially means you don't have to follow this curve to survive. Right? You don't have to go through rapid growth and subject yourself to the insecurity of facing rebirth and death. Instead, you can just stay down here. Right? You can live in this space. And in fact, you can make this jump knowing that if you screw up, you can come back down here. Right? And so there's essentially 4 pathways that we're trying to explore. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to help walk us through how we're going to figure out who does what. One is, you stay here, right? And that's what many argue is the small business cliff. Like you run up to that cliff and you want to stay small because you don't want to lose that status and have to enter over here. Some run, some decide to make the jump, and we're trying to figure out who does that, who decides to go over here, and what happens to them. Of those that make the jump, some of them are going to be so successful that they get bought, right? That's really the outcome for many small businesses. It's not that they emerge and become the next Lockheed Martin, rather success is they get absorbed by the Lockheed Martins of the world. The other option is they die, right? Some number of them are just going to go away. But then some other portion of them are going to go Benjamin Button on us, right? They're going to go back to the womb. They're going to get younger again. They're going to go up here, and then they're going to come back and survive again in the small business world. And that's what we're trying to figure out. So, Amanda.
Okay, thanks. So at this point, we're obligated to say, I know Trevor's already mentioned that our project is funded, but despite NPS's funding of the program doesn't mean that they're endorsing anything that we say from this point on. So let me talk broadly about the research project, And then I'll talk more specifically about this particular study. So the project is designed so that we track the performance of 1,000 firms over a 10-year period. And we were intentional about not selecting those firms based on any criteria of products or services. We truly wanted a random mix of those to get a snapshot of what that market looked like. But we did want to make sure that we captured a percentage of defense contracts that mirrored defense spending. So we did stratify the sample in that way. But we selected firms that had a small business set-aside contract action in 2005 and followed them through 2014. And what that means, having a small business set-aside action, is they had some contract activity on a contract that was currently coded as a small business set-aside contract. And I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. So that's one part of our analysis, and as Trevor mentioned, we've also been interviewing small businesses, mid-sized firms, and we're getting ready to start interviewing federal procurement officials. So our data came from two places. The first is from the Federal Procurement Data System, which is all contract officers, federal contract officers, have to enter data on any unclassified contract action over $3,000 into this system. And it captures contract actions, as I mentioned just a moment ago, which means that anytime there's a contract that's established, a contract that's modified, say more time is added, more money is added, money's taken away, performance metrics change, administrative matters occur, there's a new contract action that they're required by federal policy to enter. So that captures information on the number of bidders on the contract, whether the contract is set aside or not, any particular category of set aside. In our case, we are just looking at small business set asides. We're not looking at any of those other specified categories that Trevor mentioned. They're in our data, but we're not drilling into those. These are all just small business. And then we marry that with firm data from Dun & Bradstreet. So in order to be classified as a small business through the Small Business Administration, you have to have a DUNS number. And that DUNS number is a unique identifier for each firm. And DUNS then begins to collect information about your firm. Information on your creditworthiness, a myriad of different types of attributes. And so firms report that annually, and they also externally grab data on those particular firms. So one piece of data that they grab is directly from the Small Business Association and whether that firm was a small business, designated a small business in that particular year. So question.
Is small business just number of employees?
No.
What's the?
Yeah, good question. So small businesses, they're either designated as small business based on number of employees or dollar value and revenue. So for example, a firm is classified as a small business in manufacturing if they have 500 or fewer employees. An accounting firm, 20 million or less. Consulting firm, 15 million in annual revenue or less. There are other categories. I'm trying to think of one that was really particularly kind of interesting. I'm sure it'll come to me in a moment. But there are firms that are over 1,000 employees and they still qualify based on their categorization, right? Telecom firms, right? So you can't just use a dollar threshold or a number of employees threshold when you classify small business. You have to go back to that small business categorization because it varies so wildly. Yeah,
Are the set-asides from the FPDS database strictly between government and the small business, or does it include contracts like through Battelle, which is a bigger business, but will subcontract?
So we
with
are
the small
only
business?
looking at prime contracts, not at subcontracts.
That's what prime means? Okay,
Yep.
I saw that on the graph, but I wasn't sure.
Yep, so only prime contracts, so that's the direct contract.
So even if Battelle has to submit who it's going to subcontract with, and even if that includes a small business, that's not considered a set aside or prime contracts?
No, that's a separate category, and prime contractors typically, as part of their contracts, have a percentage of their value that has to go to subs, but that's not included in here. These are just the direct relationships. So our unit of analysis in the data is supplier year, firm year. We interchangeably use that word. And so we aggregated the NPS, the contracts data by year. So basically we collapsed it upon itself. So we know for a particular firm in 2005, we know the average number of bidders across all of their contracts, or they had 5 contracts with DoD and 3 with DOE, and we have the dollar values associated with it aggregated together. Dun & Bradstreet data is annually reported, and so we were able to utilize that relatively simply in terms of capturing that data. Although, given the size of these firms, small businesses, there's a lot of missing data. So I can answer some questions, just kind of given the time. I won't talk about all of our imputation techniques, but that took up a sizable amount of our time, is just figuring out how to appropriately impute values. We did not impute at all any of the contract data, but we did some of the firm data. So cleaning, coding, creating the right data structure. When I first started working with FPDS, which was 3 years ago, it took me and my research assistant at the time a year to learn how to appropriately clean and code that data. It is not meant for this type of analysis, and so it requires a lot of investment in order to utilize it, which is why very few scholars even decide to use this type of data. And once we started working on the structure for this particular project, we've been at that another year. I mean, so these are, you're not just, as Trevor mentioned, ripping down a data set from a website. These types of investments take a considerable amount of time. And so what you'll see, and what I'll be presenting in a moment, we are still, after this period of time, getting to know our data. We are still sitting with it and trying to figure out what it's telling us. So the data for this particular study is small businesses in 2005 that were SBA certified. So remember I said that word contract action? They had a small business contract action in 2005. That means that they had an activity on a small business contract. About 15% of our sample of 1,000 firms had already graduated in 2005. So it was just a legacy contract that they still had activity on. So in this particular sample, we are just looking at just over 800 firms that were all confirmed small businesses in 2005. 721 of those stayed a small business through that period. 46 of those firms grew to mid-sized, and then 55 grew to mid-sized and fell back during that 10-year time period.
So did any die, or did you require them to stay in through 14?
So some of them died along the way as well.
So would that be included in the 721, or is that?
They would be included in the 721, but I don't have the specifics on those numbers at this point. We did some qualitative analysis last summer, and in our entire sample, there were about 140 firms that we did not have data on in 2014. And so I hired an undergraduate to do some PI work over the summer, calling phone numbers, doing some web searches, and about half of those we knew went out of business during that time period.
That probably includes mergers and acquisitions too.
It does not, actually.
Oh, I thought it did, no?
No, you're right. It does in some cases. Or it was John's Plumbing, and now it's John's and Sons Plumbing. In some of those cases, right, and the DUNS number in some of those cases doesn't change, but for a variety of probably legal reasons it does. So we're comparing firm attributes and federal contracting portfolios among 3 groups. So as the state small, those that grew and returned. So because I want to leave you time for questions, I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. But firm attributes come from Dun & Bradstreet. So that's creditworthiness, their ownership status, their firm age, so when are they incorporated, as we, lines of business, so how many different types of business activities are they involved in. This Dunn's family, this is the number of corporate relationships that they have, formal corporate connections, number of employees in sales. These are we know that these will be determinant factors because that's what SBA status is gauged on, so that's a good validity check. And then given the data, our measure of efficiency is pretty blunt. It's just sales divided by employees. So trying to figure out how efficiently they're utilizing those resources. In terms of the contracts data, these diversity variables, we want to know how many different agencies are small businesses operating in. So do they have a wide strategy or a deep strategy? NAICS and PSC, lines of business, NAICS and PSC, essentially are measuring the same thing. We're trying to figure out which one will ultimately be the more appropriate measure. But it's how many different types of businesses are they engaged in, or business activities. Contract actions, just how much activity do they have? How many contract actions, modifications? And then there's something called an indefinite delivery vehicle. These 4 variables really get at competition. So an indefinite delivery vehicle is a contract that can be won, or more typically, it's a group of prime vendors wins. And they're the only ones that can bid on the work within that particular contract for a specified period of time. We're like a fishing license. So that means you may have a 10-year purchase agreement and only 8 firms can ever bid on any of the work within that particular agency. So it's like its own specialized, unique market. Number of offers. We also wanted to look and see, well, how successful were firms at competing in contracts that weren't set-asides or in environments that were full and open competition versus, non-competitive. So these are just differences in means. So this is just getting to know our data. We are not making any deterministic leaps here. We don't know what the relationships really are. But this will begin to tell us what we need to do next. So our dependent variable is small business status. So did it stay small? Did it grow? Did it grow in return? What you'll see here, these arrows are indications of the direction. So credit ratings for mid-sized firms were lower than those that stayed small. And anytime there's an arrow, you'll see that it was a statistically significant relationship in the means difference. The only thing that I want to really point out on this slide is that between those that were mid-size and returned to small, the pattern is consistent when they're compared to those that stayed small. And what becomes kind of interesting, which we'll look at in a moment, are the differences between those that returned and those that were able to be successful, at least during this time period, in the middle market. So for those that transitioned into the middle market and stayed, and those that transitioned and fell back, they had more corporate relationships, which is likely, using very tentative language here, indicative of acquisitions, joint ventures, partnerships. They're both less likely to be women-owned, which is kind of curious. They tend to have lower credit scores, lower efficiency measures, and I'll talk more about this in just a moment. They have higher diversity in terms of their agencies, their product lines. They're taking the broader and the deeper route. Competition is kind of interesting because what we see is that they have more contracts that are full and open, and they have fewer contracts that are set-aside contracts. So that's indicative of them being able to compete in that space more aggressively. But they also had more IDVs, so that's interesting because that means that's a sheltered market in and of itself. When I say lasting transition, and again, in a very tentative way here, these are firms comparing those mid-sized firms to those that were mid-sized and returned back. Again, fewer women-owned firms. They tend to be younger firms, and that comports with the entrepreneurship literature that shows that you tend to have high growth trajectory rates among firms earlier in their life cycle. More corporate relationships, fewer set-aside contracts, but then something interesting begins to happen, and it makes us wonder if there is perhaps a tipping point in diversity, because among those firms that stayed in the mid-tier, their agency diversity and product diversity measures were a little bit lower than those that returned, and their efficiency measures were a little bit higher. So there's something that may be going on there that we need to tease out a bit further. With the interview data, what we're hearing from business owners and executives is that it's pretty clear that they're making a strategic decision to move out of that small business space. I mean, they're very aware of what their thresholds are and making clear decisions about whether they operate just under it or whether they decide to move into that mid-tier. Those that do jump tend to be more focused on profit growth, and what we mean by that is these are not lifestyle firms. These are firms that aggressively want to be acquired or position themselves to grow, in part just for innate reasons. That goes back to a leadership issue of the owner. Firms that survive, we're hearing similar things to what our data is beginning to tell us: diversity in products, diversity in agencies. And making significant internal infrastructure and resource, like business development resources, to prepare for that move into the mid-tier, which would potentially help to explain the lower credit ratings because they're using more of their capital, and also their lower efficiency ratings because they're pouring more money into their back end than than their counterparts. And certainly trusted partnerships, both relationships with their agency partners or federal partners, but also among their peer groups. Those seem to be, that seems to be a particular area where some of our firms that are successfully merging rely heavily on those relationships. So we need to start moving into multivariate analysis. There are some really interesting patterns in the data that are not what we presented here today. Things like, firms that will do business with the federal government for 3 or 4 years and then have a several-year gap and then do it again. I mean, there's just some really interesting patterns that we're excited to explore. Integrate our interview analysis, and of course, as Trevor said, ultimately we're trying to get at what the policy implications of this study are. But we will need to set this up as a longitudinal study. We're open certainly to ideas about how to structure the data. We're kicking around a number of different ideas now. But any questions that we haven't answered at this point?
The organization are you interviewing? What is their position?
Mm-hmm. So in some cases, we've been interviewing owners or partners. In other cases, we've interviewed like growth officers or business development officers. And most of these firms are fairly intimate. So I don't know if you want to add anything onto that.
No, I mean, you've got people that are performing multiple roles in most of their positions.
Just curious how much internal debate there is in some of these organizations.
Every organization that we've interviewed typically has had a strong founder, where the personality of the founder still drives the personality of the firm. And that's the big leap. Some of them, as Amanda referenced, are open about saying, we're a lifestyle firm. Me and a buddy created this thing, and we just found we could keep this thing going by living under the small business thresholds. Mm-hmm. Sounds pretty good. Let's keep it up. Whereas others are much more like, I'm in this to make money. I wanted to grow a firm, and I'm using this to position myself.
Or to just show that I can do it.
Show- yeah.
It's just, it's that kind of innate entrepreneurial drive. And did you have any questions?
So you're only looking at small business set-asides and the data. Is there any chance that someone who has like a high-level minority ownership could double dip and get the minority set-aside as well?
So it's not exactly a double dip. It doesn't exactly work that way. So 23% of government contracts are small business contracts. Of that 23, 3% have to go to minority-owned firms, 5% to women-owned firms. So it's a subset within.
And it's not an apples to apples comparison because the marketplace is different, right? I mean, so what would be, I think that's a useful comparison. It's one we need to do, at least narratively, right? To say that here's what the literature says on average, and our data says at about 10%.
We would expect it to be less among this group because they're gating it.
Right. And so in the general population, we'd expect to see 30%, whatever it is.
10%.
Right. So we can do that comparison.
Yeah.
The one that we'd love to get that's harder is if you're a small firm and you're doing business with the government and you choose not to go small business set aside, what's your likelihood of success versus if you go through the sheltered marketplace? That's the real apples to apples comparison. Because the federal government is a different animal than just surviving in the marketplace.
Well, in that case, what proportion of these small businesses, what proportion of their revenue is generated from this contract? And for some, it may be a big proportion, and some it may be a little proportion.
Correct.
So if it's a little proportion, then that may be more similar to this other group I'm describing. The proportion, because that's the whole market,
You got
this
it.
isn't common.
You got it.
And we've been trying to get at that with the data. And so it's been complicated. Because it's not just a straight, because of the way that the contract actions are, because of the way that they're entered, you're basically capturing an entire value of the contract, the day that it is let, rather than knowing, oh, this is actually a 5-year contract and they got.
So how do you spread it out over the businesses?
You got it.
Yeah. Right.
So, but that's what we're beginning. You've put your finger on the kinds of comparisons we need to make to be able to make. Yeah.
Yes, you said you hadn't gotten to it yet, but intend to do more work on whether some of the policy implications and so on. And I'd say that a couple of remarks about the Small Business Administration. I'm influenced about that by my time in Alaska on President Johnson's committee for developing Alaska after the earthquake, because we dealt with all of the federal agencies in trying to get Alaska going. And one of them important ones in Alaska, of course, small population and just getting underway at that time, was the Small Business Administration. And I would say that it's the most political of any agency that I've ever run across in 21 years of federal service. And not political bad, but very political. And so one of the things that happens is, and I've always wondered why it's so political, and that is, the answer I think is that there's so many political districts around. Everybody has a congressman, everyone, senator, and so on. So there is kind of the thought that it's very, very close to the citizenry, and everyone in districts feel that they ought to have a chunk of SBA activity. And Alaska certainly got more than its share during my time there. But that relates to another aspect, and that is that we were kind of using it as an economic growth idea.
Right.
Because again, there's so many small businesses getting going, and so we use it as an instrument in which it was not necessarily intended, at least as a broad policy. But on the one other quick point is when you're all done, you might also take a look and see how do these outcomes fit with the mission of SBA.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you had in front of you the head of SBA and you're on the appropriations committee for that day, you'd want to ask, how does all this actually fit with your overall mission? So just a couple of remarks about SBA.
Yeah, no, that's a great remark because, oh yeah, sorry. Right, we can continue this, but just to quickly answer that question. If you look at the initiating legislation, I mean, it is to stimulate economic growth. Small businesses are the engine of the American economy, and they need to have their fair share. And also to support national security and all kinds of other wonderful things. But you're right, this was not intended to be a subsidy program for firms for their entire lifespan to just sit under a particular threshold. That's not supporting economic growth. And so there are really interesting implications on either side of this issue.
It's also got identity politics designed into it, right? Like there's you, this group of people, you get this, and then there's this group, and then there's this group, and then there's group. So yeah, highly politicized. Katie.
You probably, like, this is probably whole literature I just don't know about, but do we know a lot about, like, the determinants for why a small business would pursue a government contract in the first place? And can those selection effects, no?
There's not a lot of literature. I mean, then that's why we're entering, like, we are one of the first movers into this space. That's why I sort of, when the firms approached me, I was like, oh, somebody's done this.
Yeah, it's very like obvious. So that selection into that in the first place gives you your comparison, right?
And
What percent of small businesses do this? Is this like 5% of small businesses or 50% of small businesses? Or?
That's a good question.
well, so the National
Yeah.
Center on the Middle Market, when we first approached them about this, said, we're not interested because their sample, and they have a membership body, I can't remember, it was like 3 firms did business to government activity. So that's mid-sized firms, that's not small-sized firms. But those were small firms at one point. Then they've done some more work and realized, there's more out there than we thought.
Are you also doing an analysis on firm attributes in terms of industry, so they're probably mostly defense?
Well, so it's less industry than product, which is a map for industry in the sense that it's not defense as much as it's, we make missiles, we do program management, but program management we could sell to DoD or Department of Energy, right? We can always
Figure the data set and just like run a regression that looks at the attributes of when you pursue a government contract. I'm serious.
Right. No, seriously.
I know. Okay. Yeah.
Duns.
But, like,
For those of you who want to do business with
use that to
Duns,
estimate the likelihood of
Very
selecting
expensive.
those of you who want to do business with Duns, they are not an easy customer.
Yeah, turn this, cut that off for this one. Yeah.
Duns,
Make sure you.
Duns is not easy.
Yeah. Right, just these, this was about 10,000.
We're way over. If people need to go, we won't be offended if you gotta go. We're happy to hang out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, quick question related to Doug's question. I was wondering that some of these contracts are really big. They involve a lot of technology, so you have subcontractors. You're not looking at those. But is it the case that those small administrations or small businesses can especially have an opportunity of getting a contract if it is geographically bound? What I mean is, I listened to a number of interviews with people who are bidding to help build the wall with Mexico.
So
So there are multiple, probably hundreds of people contract for a particular section. And it's going to be like a mosaic.
So SBA, when I showed you that's about $50 to $60 billion annually, and it was different shades, there's a portion of that that's called hub zone money, which is in a specific geographic region. They designate that as a sort of a business incubator zone. And so it's that intersection of small business and geography, you can win a contract. So, yeah. Thank you.